Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully we have some more folks rolling in over the next couple of minutes, but I want to get things underway. My name is Alex Latta. I'm the interim director of the Cold Regions Research Center, and I'll be hosting today alongside Jeremy Leathers from the ECR leadership team, who's going to be playing a backup role to support questions and stuff like that. And also we'll jump in if I suddenly get cut off. I think you've seen a message already when you're logging in, but we are recording this session, so just be aware that your participation may be recorded. I want to start today by offering a brief land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the numerous Indigenous peoples whose lands we are calling in from today. We're hosting here at Laurier from the traditional territories of the Arawandurun, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. For our visitors from outside the region, I'll just share that Laurier sits within a 950,000 acre tract of land granted to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in 1784 by the British, but which was subsequently eroded to just 5% of its former extent, where the Six Nations Reserve currently sits. This territory is also governed by the One Dish, One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe Confederacies, reminding us that the wealth of the land is to be shared and cared for in common. For those of us of settler heritage, it behooves us to seek out and uphold our own responsibilities within the framework of these historic agreements. Well, it's my pleasure today to welcome three members of Oak Ridge National Laboratory as our panelists. They're going to be sharing today with us about the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiments Arctic project. NGEE Arctic is a long-term endeavor of the U.S. Department of Energy that brings together 140 scientists from national laboratories and universities to advance Earth system models that predict how thawing permafrost in the Arctic impacts global climate systems. Dr. Stan Wullschleger is Associate Laboratory Director for Biological and Environmental Systems Science, as well as an Oak Ridge National Laboratory Corporate Fellow. His research focuses on global change biology and plant ecology. Dr. Wullschleger is director of the NGEE Arctic project. Dr. Colleen Iverson is distinguished staff scientist in the Environmental Sciences Division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and group leader of the Plant-Soil Interactions Group, also deputy director of the NGEE Arctic project. She uses a variety of field and laboratory techniques to understand and predict how ecosystems are shaped by environmental change, with a particular focus on plant root systems across a variety of landscapes. And finally, Peter Thornton is distinguished staff scientist in the Environmental Sciences Division at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and leader of the Earth Systems Science section. He studies the interactions of land ecosystems with all other components of the Earth's climate system, including biogeochemical and physical land atmosphere feedbacks, as well as interactions with human systems. His work includes model development, evaluation, and applications to discover emergent properties of ecosystems. So for our event today, the panel is going to last about 45 to 50 minutes, after which we will have time for questions. The very latest, we'll be closing things off by 3:30. Please use the chat function to enter your questions at any time. Jeremy and I will line them up for when the panel presentation concludes. If you are joining us from the Northwest Territories on your lunch break and can't stay till 3:30, just let us know in your chat. We'll try to prioritize your question. Also, if you have questions for Dr. Iverson, we'll prioritize those as well, since she has to leave the webinar at 3 p.m. I noticed that I actually do have an option also to let you speak. So if you would rather ask a question speaking, I can even convert you into a panelist, I believe, and you could then turn on your camera and ask a question if you wish. So if you'd rather put up your hand in the I'll see that in the participants lineup here and can enable you to ask your question verbally if you'd like. So with that, and with great pleasure, I pass things over to our panelists.
All right, Alex, thank you very much for that kind introduction. On behalf of the NGEE Arctic project, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and along with Colleen and Peter, as well as other colleagues on the NGEE Arctic project from Los Alamos, Berkeley, Brookhaven National Laboratory, and our University of Alaska Fairbanks colleagues. We look forward to over the next 45 minutes to an hour and a half sharing with you our story, if you will, which includes not only discovery science, but integration of knowledge from that science into multi-scale models, including Earth system models. Alex mentioned that we are a large team of approximately 140 individuals that work across field and laboratory work. But we also have a considerable number of modelers that work with us as well. So we prioritize our research throughout Alaska in field and laboratory and discovery science, but then also using a variety of multi-scale models to inform our science. And then those multi-scale models benefit as well from the knowledge derived from our discovery science research. Colleen, could I have the next slide, please? The unique opportunity that we have within NGEE Arctic is really driven by a mandate that was given to us by our sponsors at the Department of Energy as early as 2012 in the project, when we were asked to deliver a process reach ecosystem model that would describe the evolution of Arctic ecosystems, particularly tundra ecosystems in a changing climate, and being able to use that information to incorporate into high-resolution Earth system models that operate at a scale of meters up to kilometers and Earth system grid cells. Now, we have taken this mandate to heart throughout the last 10 years of the project, and we have found it to be a very exciting opportunity for not only field and laboratory scientists to work together, but also to work alongside our modeling colleagues in quite what we think is a very exciting arrangement for conducting research and making sure that that knowledge derived is incorporated rather quickly into Earth system models. Next slide. Now, one of the early challenges that we had within the NGEE Arctic project was to consider for tundra ecosystems, what were the processes that we knew to be sensitive to a changing climate and also poorly represented in Earth system models. We had the opportunity from the beginning to focus on permafrost thaw. We certainly knew that with a warming climate, these would be important for greenhouse gas emissions in the form of CO2 and methane. But we also felt that with permafrost thaw and subsidence, there would be not only thermokarst formation, but other types of disturbance that we would want to study as well. And so permafrost thaw was a central component of our science, as was shrub expansion, where we wanted to understand not only greenhouse gas forcings to climate, but energy balance and albedo feedbacks as well to climate with shrub expansion onto tundra ecosystems. And so we have had important focus on plant traits and shrub dynamics, and including both thawing permafrost and shrub expansion into our models. Next slide. We also have found that over the course of the NGEE Arctic project that hydrology and water distribution across changing landscapes has been important. I mentioned earlier thermokarst formation, subsidence due to the melting of ground ice, preferential flow paths, and lateral distribution of water across the landscape was important, as well as understanding precipitation regimes across the Arctic and really trying to get at this question of with permafrost thaw, thermokarst formation, and changing climate, will the Arctic become wetter or drier? And what then might be the consequences of that for greenhouse gas emissions as well as shrub expansion? So really three areas of interest within the NGEE Arctic project. Next slide. Now, we've had an opportunity to implement our research in these three areas across multiple phases since the inception of the project in 2012. And you'll hear Colleen and Peter talk about phase 1, 2, and 3. But in phase 1, we had an opportunity to set up field research sites on the North Slope of Alaska, working on polygonal landscapes outside of Barrow, Alaska, or now Utqiagvik, Alaska, and really test some of the measurement and modeling strategies that we had in mind for NGEE Arctic. And this was a great opportunity for our team to come together, work not only in the field and laboratory, but as I said, alongside our modelers. And phase 1 turned out to be a very exciting and successful period for us. And in 2015, we moved into phase 2, which was a period in which we expanded our field sites from the North Slope of Alaska onto the Seward Peninsula of Western Alaska. And in fact, we increased our field sites from 1 on the North Slope to now having 3 additional sites on the Seward Peninsula, addressing a number of questions related to discovery science, but also process representation that would then go into, as we talked about, of those multi-scale models, including the Earth system scale or model. And then in 2019, we had an opportunity to move to phase 3, in which we would not only add breadth to the science questions, but continue to add depth to our understanding and representing processes within multi-scale models. And at this point in the project, the Department of Energy actually had their own Earth system model, E3SM. And Peter will talk a little bit about that Earth system model along with ELM, the land component of that model. But this provided just a great opportunity to conduct our measurements, but also have a rather direct and immediate handoff to some of the Earth system model development that was going on, as well as benchmarking some of our process representation against NGEE Arctic data and other synthesis products that we've been developing with the national as well as the international Arctic science community. Next slide. I mentioned phase 1 and 2 and the opportunities that we had to establish not only field sites on the North Slope of Alaska, but in phase 2, Seward Peninsula. This provided us an opportunity to look not only at cold and continuous permafrost, but also warm, discontinuous permafrost, and be able to begin to look at a north-south gradient where we could look at different active layer depths throughout the season, different vegetation types, and different patterns of water distribution across the landscape, including both surface water and lateral hydrology, as well as the formation of these preferential vertical flow paths that are set up in discontinuous permafrost environments. I should mention that early in the project, we benefited from support from the Atmospheric Radiation Measurement Program. This is a program that's also funded through our Department of Energy sponsor, but also taking advantage of a wide range of support provided not only by Barrow Arctic Science Consortium and UIC Science on the North Slope, but really a wonderful relationship with numerous native corporations on the Seward Peninsula, as well as interactions with the University of Alaska Northwest campus in Nome. Next slide. Just give you an idea of some of the activities of phase 1 and 2. Certainly working on the North Slope of Alaska, we had a lot to learn about working in these remote and cold environments. But as I said, we had very good support, both logistically and from a housing standpoint. We were able to develop the infrastructure that we needed to conduct the work across these polygonal landscapes. And then by the time phase 3 rolled around, we were able to add additional research sites, adopt new technology, and deploy new capabilities in the field that simply enriched the discovery science that we were doing at all of the sites at this time for the NG Arctic project. Next slide. And so I think when we began phase 3 in 2019 and benefiting from all the work that we had invested time and energy in during phase 1 and 2, we really had a north-south gradient of topography, permafrost, vegetation, and hydrology, in which we would be able to explore one of 6 science questions. Now, we have been exploring those throughout phase 1 and 2, but it really was the beginning of phase 3 where we could look at these across the gradient of conditions. And we were able to look at processes related to landscape, evolution, biogeochemistry, plant traits, shrub expansion, hydrology, and then a variety of forms of disturbance, including fire. And if we go to the next slide, we can outline each of those science questions, Q1 through 6, along with some icons that both Peter and Colleen will be using throughout the rest of the presentation. I won't elaborate on necessarily any one of these 6 questions, but they will be referred to later on in the presentation. So I think you'll see that landscape evolution, greenhouse gases, plant functional traits, shrub expansion, the central question 5 of will the Arctic get wetter or drier, and what will that mean for climate forcings? And then question 6 was certainly one that had to do with fire, thermokarst, and other forms of disturbances, and what those mean for structure and function of these ecosystems. And so next slide. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Colleen. Colleen, thank you.
Thanks, Stan. And as Stan mentioned, we do have those 6 science questions on the discovery science that defines our project, but it's easier for the purposes of this particular talk if I combine those into 3 themes. So the first theme that I'll talk about is landscape heterogeneity, which is integral to the sites that the NG Arctic is studying, as Stan was telling you about. So this is reflected across multiple interactions and responses in the topographic variable landscapes of warm discontinuous permafrost on the Seward Peninsula, from changing rain and snow precipitation signals that alter hydrologic responses across hillscope environments, all the way to disturbances that range from fires to thermokarst pond development in the more northern tundra plains. So this image shows the heterogeneous landscape that the NG Arctic project considers, sort of extending from the bottom of the permafrost through to the ground surface with a seasonal snowpack to the top of the grasses and the shrubs. And so in our project in NG Arctic, we consider how topography, soil heterogeneity, and vegetation co-vary to drive and reshape fluxes of water and carbon. And we're also considering how snow distribution interacts with landscape heterogeneity. And Stan and others just got back from a snow campaign on the Seward Peninsula, which looked like a lot of fun. But in particular, thinking about investigations aimed at better understanding the interrelationships between snow distribution, shrubs, and permafrost temperatures, and using observations and modeling approaches to better understand the complex interplay between those elements. And further, in phase 3, we added this new question to consider how disturbances such as fire and permafrost thaw can rapidly alter storage and release of carbon from the permafrost and lead to enhanced feedbacks to the climate and possible acceleration of changes in the Arctic. And I wanted to mention, I don't have time to go into the details here, but if you're interested in reading more about the underlying papers within this theme or the next 2 themes I'll be presenting, or in accessing the freely available public data sets that are associated with these findings, you can check out the NG Arctic website for more information there. So the next theme is biogeochemistry. And this touches on multiple NG Arctic questions that concern vegetation, soils, and hydrology across spatial scales from microorganisms to landscapes, and across temporal scales from seconds to centuries. The overarching conclusion from our work thus far on tundra biogeochemical cycling is that improved understanding of soil hydrobiogeochemistry, the interaction between water and the biogeochemical cycling, as well as interactions between plants and soils, can help improve predictions, model predictions of carbon dioxide and methane fluxes and carbon cycle responses to climate warming. Our findings thus far within the NG Arctic project involve multiple biogeochemical cycles, so that includes carbon and nutrients, but other elements as well, including iron and phosphorus, mercury cycling, and the cycling of those elements between soils, plants, and fluxes of greenhouse gases from the soil. More specifically, our project has identified how substrate availability, microbial community structure, and variations in the soil environment control seasonal and spatial patterns of carbon dioxide and methane fluxes across permafrost landscapes. We've also refined theory and observations related to permafrost soil organic matter cycling and how it interacts with geochemical cycling. So key insights from this part of the project have pushed the science of iron redox investigations and interactions with organic matter decomposition and stabilization forward, as well as better understanding mercury release from decomposing permafrost organic matter and how phosphorus is trapped in soil minerals. And finally, we've used a combination of advanced modeling and observations, approach that our project is taking, to improve predictive model understanding of how coupling between plant and soil carbon and nutrient cycling drives Arctic ecology and biogeochemical responses to warming. And the third theme that I would aggregate our 6 discovery science questions into is vegetation dynamics. So the different distributions of plant communities across the landscape and how they change over time and in response to climate change is a critical part of our project. So vegetation, as you know, exerts major control over greenhouse gas fluxes from tundra ecosystems and surface energy balance. And in turn, future vegetation distributions could be controlled by climate as well as nutrient cycling feedbacks, the traits of those vegetation and disturbances like fire or thermokarst. But these complex controls of interactions between vegetation and the landscape are mostly missing from the current generation of Earth system land models. Our conclusions thus far within the project are that quantifying tundra plant traits improves model parameterization of tundra vegetation. Models didn't used to represent specific tundra plant traits at all before. So improving our model representation of vegetation form and function across the landscape. But in order to resolve ecosystem processes like disturbance, competition, or regeneration, it's important that we and the models be able to accurately predict future vegetation distributions across the landscape. So vegetation interacts with multiple processes above and below ground across the tundra landscape. And some specific NG Arctic findings in this area are that photosynthesis specific to tundra plants is important to get righted models, since photosynthesis is the interface between the carbon in the atmosphere and the carbon on the landscape. But models are totally lacking Arctic specific photosynthetic traits and parameters. So we've developed those for some plant species on the North Slope as well as further south on the Seward Peninsula. And then based on that information, we're able to develop scaling relationships from leaves to the landscape scale by developing quantitative relationships between traits we can measure in the field and their spectral signature observed by drones, planes, and satellites. And furthermore, through field modeling and satellite analyses, we can determine the controls on shrub expansion, so that shrubification question that Stan mentioned. And then finally, using these data at multiple scales, at multiple places on the landscape, we can better represent specific tundra plant vegetation in these land surface models, and hopefully extend to the Pan-Arctic, so we can predict how vegetation changes in response to a changing climate and also better understand those feedbacks. So now I'm going to hand it over to Peter to tell you how our discovery science is being used to predict the future of tundra ecosystems and models at all scales through this integrated and iterative modeling approach.
Thanks, Colleen. And hi, everybody. Multi-scale modeling is at the heart of the NGEE Arctic mission, which, just to recap the slide earlier from Stan, is to deliver a process-rich model in which the evolution of Arctic ecosystems in a changing climate can be modeled at the scale of a high-resolution Earth system model grid cell. Now, at the very start of the project, in the phase 1, we had to extrapolate forward in time to imagine and understand what this would mean for the eventual Earth system model deliverables toward the end of the project. And for example, what are the most important processes to focus on? And what is the scale of a high resolution ESM Earth system model grid cell? Over the course of the project, we have converged on that set of crucial process representations that we're trying to capture, and in collaboration with DOE's Earth System modeling project called E3SM, we have converged on a 1 kilometer land grid cell with a deeply nested hierarchical subgrid of different landscape elements as that high resolution target that we are trying to inform. Next slide. So our approach to do that has been to develop close collaborations among the observationalists and experimentalists and modelers, as you've heard from Stan and Colleen already, to be able to synthesize new process knowledge emerging from these Q1 through Q6 investigations. Next slide. And integrate that knowledge into a multi-scale modeling approach that allows us to migrate mechanistic understanding gained at fine scales up to an improved predictive capability at that high resolution ESM or system modeling scale. So I'll show you in a minute the specific areas that we've identified for that ESM scale model improvement. But first, I want to say a few words about how we arrived at those topics that we were targeting in the first place. Next slide. We began by asking the questions, what are the most important processes driving observed variability in Arctic tundra systems? And then of those processes, which seemed like they would require new effort to capture correctly in the Earth system models. And this has been an iterative process using multiple models, analysis of parameter sensitivity within the models, and also evaluation of model results against available observations. Next slide. So we then tried to apply some practical constraints by asking what are the reasonable limits of mechanistic representation and what are the limits of predictability at scales where measurements can actually be made. For example, is it necessary to explicitly represent multiple interacting populations of soil microbes in order to predict site level fluxes of CO2 and methane? And if so, can we make the measurements needed to scale this constraint up to entire watersheds, landscapes, and eventually the whole Pan-Arctic? And we've used our most highly resolved process models, what we call our fine scale models, to address these questions. Next slide. Now, given the potential for prediction at fine scales, our fundamental scaling problem then is how much of that detail can be captured in an ESM scale implementation and how much has to be handled through approaches to reduce complexity or approximations. And we also need to quantify losses in prediction skill due to those approximations and decide how much loss is acceptable. So that's a compromise that we're always trying to straddle. So next slide. Then finally, we have to design and test practical methods to incorporate that new process complexity and those complexity reduction approaches into our target ESM. That's the E3SM land model, or ELM, just to throw another acronym out there. Next slide, please. Now in phase 3, we've actually done enough work on all aspects of those questions that I just reviewed to arrive at a few important conclusions. First, we can say with certainty that fine scale models are capable of representing many Arctic tundra processes. And second, we've shown that intermediate scale models can capture processes with acceptable accuracy and practical cost. Third, we've concluded that the combination of high resolution land grids and nested hierarchical subgrid representations are viable mechanisms for migrating process knowledge to that Earth system model scale. Next. Now we use a diversity of models operating across, as I've said already, fine, intermediate, and Earth system model scales to integrate this new knowledge from the Q1 through Q6 studies and to synthesize existing multi-scale data sets targeting improved predictive skill in 6 different process areas within ELM, that E3SM land model. Next slide. So here are those 6 integrated modeling or IM topics. IM1 and IM2 address tundra physical processes of fractional inundated area and hill slope hydrology. IM3 focuses on the interactions of snow, terrain, and vegetation. IM4 addresses the need to improve the description of Arctic tundra vegetation physiology and the vegetation soil interactions. IM5 builds on that to include predictions of biogeography and the dynamics of vegetation types as they move across the landscape over time. IM6 focuses on the representation of biogeochemical dynamics controlling fluxes of CO2 and methane. Now in the next 3 slides, I'll provide examples of how the integrated modeling teams are using a diversity of approaches to address the challenge of developing these new predictive skills within E3SM. So next slide. So first example is related to improved representation of Arctic tundra plant traits. And on the left, the observed diversity of vegetation types and communities is shown for the Cougarok field site on the Seward Peninsula, one of the 3 main field sites in that area. The bar charts then show on the left how vegetation at this site is represented in a standard E3SM land model with 3 very general types plus a bare ground fraction. And then on the right, how 9 new vegetation types are combined in various fractions to represent the observed diversity of the community structure across that site. This example is an illustration of how new process details can be incorporated directly into our Earth system model land component ELM using the spatial scaling capability provided by a nested subgrid representation. Next slide. A second example illustrates how we're using fine and intermediate scale models to derive new parameterizations that are applicable within ELM. And this example is related to improved representation of fractional inundated area, which strongly controls the thermal and the biogeochemical dynamics of tundra landscapes. On the left, you can see the real complexity of polygonal tundra near Geogvik and a fine scale modeling mesh designed to resolve processes at the scale of tens of centimeters, so very high resolution mesh model there. In the center, we can see how those kinds of detailed models can accurately capture dynamics at the single polygon scale. And on the right is an example of an intermediate scale modeling mesh that can be used to make reasonable predictions of those same dynamics across thousands of polygons with reasonable computational costs. So this is an example of our multi-scale modeling approach that leads toward implementation within the E3SM land model. Next slide, please. A third example here then illustrates how additional process representations can help to improve existing processes that are already in ELM. And on the left is an example of how machine learning methods can produce predictions of snow water equivalent at very fine spatial scales based on observations made during the snow campaigns that Colleen mentioned just a bit ago, and also based on dense landscape scale data layers. In the center is an example of an ultra high resolution ELM simulation on a 1 kilometer grid over a region that's including several of those Seward Peninsula field sites. And on the right, each of the 1 kilometer grid cell predictions of snow depth and snow water equivalent are shown here as time series. In this case, some of the key physical processes for snow dynamics already exist in ELM, but the connection to the fine scale details relating the snow dynamics to terrain and vegetation community variability still need to be parameterized. And with that, I am going to turn things back to Colleen.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, I had to find all my buttons there. Thanks, Peter. So now I will sort of wrap things up and try to tie things together for you at the project level. So as Stan mentioned, the science within the NGEE Arctic project is really done in support of the Department of Energy's mission, that is to advance our predictive understanding of the Earth's climate and environmental systems to inform solutions to national challenges. And specifically for our project, what that looks like is we've been asked to deliver this process-rich model that you heard Peter talk about that extends from the bedrock to the interface between plants and the atmosphere. And that will help us to model and predict the changing Arctic at the scale of this high resolution grid cell that you've heard mentioned. And so to allow us to better understand the rapid evolution of tundra ecosystems across space and time, you've heard about how the NGEE Arctic project is organized around these 6 science questions, which span scales from the microbes to the landscape. And this discovery science that you heard Peter talk about a little bit too informs the development of these 6 model modules that span model scales and processes from inundation to vegetation dynamics. So to tie it all together, I wanted to remind you about what you heard today and to sort of reiterate how connected we are across experimentalists and modelers within the project and also across scientific disciplines. So first, the NGEE Arctic team spans 5 institutions as well as scientific disciplines. We have diverse experiences as people, but we're glad to work together, and our collaborations are underlain by a strong foundation of mutual respect. The discovery science undertaken under science questions on landscape heterogeneity, whether the Arctic will become wetter or drier, and disturbance have led to improved understanding about how landscape heterogeneity and disturbance shape snow distribution across the landscape, permafrost thaw, and the fluxes of carbon and water. And these scientific discoveries on the impacts of landscape heterogeneity on tundra hydrobiogeochemical cycling inform integrated modeling modules on inundation dynamics, hill slope hydrology, and interactions among snow, vegetation, and terrain. And these are being simulated at models at the fine, intermediate, and Earth system scale. NGEE Arctic science questions on biogeochemistry, plant traits, and vegetation dynamics have found that soil hydrobiogeochemistry and plant-soil interactions can help predict ecosystem carbon dioxide and methane fluxes and their responses to warming at scales from laboratory incubations all the way to the footprint of an eddy flux tower. And in turn, these scientific discoveries on impacts of biogeochemical cycling on tundra greenhouse gas production over space and time inform integrated modeling modules on biogeochemical cycling, as well as the impacts of plant traits and vegetation dynamics. And they're being simulated at both the fine scale and the scale of our system models. NGEE Arctic discovery science on plant traits, vegetation dynamics, and disturbance have shown us that incorporating our observations of tundra plant traits can improve our understanding and model prediction of carbon cycling under current conditions. But in order to predict future vegetation distributions, we need to better understand ecosystem processes like seedling recruitment and response to disturbance. And these scientific discoveries on the impacts of plant traits and shrubbification inform integrated modeling modules focused on the representation of tundra plant traits and vegetation dynamics, and have been simulated in both fine and Earth system scale models. One of our activities during the pandemic has been to share our project lessons learned on building a safe and secure project culture with the broader scientific community through articles and outreach and tabletop exercises and surveys, discussing priorities for the coming year to continue our intentional development of safe and secure secure project culture. And we would be glad to talk to you about that today. And as I mentioned, all of the science that we do within the project is underlain by this foundation of trust among project participants, and also keeping each other safe, whether it be at a remote field site or in interactions where we're discussing how to move our data into models that predict the future. So our thanks to the NGEE Arctic team, which is pictured here at our recent virtual all hands meeting in February of this year, right before we played Arctic categories together virtually. Our thanks also to the United States Department of Energy. Our funding comes from the Biological and Environmental Research Program within the Department of Energy's Office of Science. And a big thanks to the Sitnusuk, Mary's Igloo, Council Bering Strait, and UIC Native corporations that have allowed us to conduct our science on the beautiful land where they've lived since time immemorial. And with that, I will see if anyone has questions, and I will turn it back over to Alex. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Colleen, Stan, Peter. That was really fascinating. So for the audience, like I said before, we can have some questions in the question and answer function there, but you also feel free to raise your hands. And I just to get us going, I mean, I have a couple of questions. So just while others are letting things percolate and whatnot, quick question. Really going to, I mean, I underlined a few times the team dynamics and the interdisciplinarity of all of this. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that. You know, particularly thinking about the modelers and the discovery scientists working together. What have been some of the challenges of that, of finding common languages and bridges and understanding? Yeah.
So Alex, I think that has been actually one of the pleasures of the NGEE Arctic project, in that right from the beginning, we knew that in order to achieve the objectives that we were being asked by the Department of Energy, we were going to have to work with and integrate a number of disciplines. Now, the challenge of that, of course, is that each of those disciplines speaks a different language. They publish in different journals, and perhaps they only see their perspective of an ecosystem, such as the tundra ecosystems that we are working on, to the exclusion of maybe other important processes and connections. So we spent a considerable time early in the project, not only learning about each other, learning about other disciplines, but learning how to communicate across those disciplinary boundaries and recognize the value of integration in answering any of the questions that we knew that we needed to ask. And in fact, the modeling turned out to be a nice way of integrating across the disciplines. And I'll turn that over to either Peter or Colleen to talk about, because I think that is unique in our project. And it does provide a unique opportunity to integrate and a modeling framework across those disciplines. So maybe Peter?
Yes, Dan, just to add to that, the model that we're working in is a global scale Earth system model as the eventual target. And so it's needing to make predictions of energy and water and carbon and nutrients and vegetation dynamics. And so it just by its nature, all of those processes are tied together. And so it really isn't possible to make progress with that model by just focusing on one very narrow question. We were kind of forced into integration of multiple knowledge threads to really make progress from the kind of basic starting point that we had for Arctic tundra process representation to be able to add new knowledge. So that's been delightful and I think has helped the modeling a lot to be able to draw on so many different observational experimental threads.
Great. Thanks very much. We have a question here from Phil Marsh. I'm going to allow Phil to talk. There you go, Phil. If you turn on your mic, you should be able to.
Okay, I think it's on. So can you hear me?
Yep.
Ken, hi Phil.
Oh, hi everybody, and thanks Colleen, Peter, and Stan. It's yeah, it was a great talk, and I've always been impressed with your project. So thanks for outlining it all to us. I have a question for Peter. It strikes me as that other than sort of the process representation, the other complexity and difficulty in large-scale climate modeling are the subgrid processes and how you integrate those and how you actually represent them in the model. I mean, this is something I've thought about and through many projects over time. So I'm curious to see how, I've seen some of it in some of your other presentations, but a bit of an outline of how you've gone about that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, Phil, because that's a deep topic. But in general, we started the project with kind of a skeleton within ELM, our land model, our E3SM land model, that accommodates multiple nested layers of subgrid heterogeneity. And the purpose for that is to be able to capture heterogeneity on the real landscapes that we know we can't represent explicitly in a global simulation everywhere. We just don't have the computational power, nor do we have the data to parameterize, say, a 1 meter scale simulation across the whole globe. And so instead, we have to identify what I call the dominant modes of variability within these landscapes, and then represent them statistically or on an area basis within grid cells that are large enough to have a practical computational problem, and also large enough that you can get reasonable data sources to begin to parameterize some of the important variability there. So Phil, I could say more. Let me pause there and see if that's beginning to get at the question that you're asking.
Yeah, that's very much getting at the question. So is it sort of just a more how different is that, do you think, from your approach at the moment versus other approaches used in Earth system type models that have similar sort of subgrid approaches? Maybe, but maybe I'm missing the complexity in your approach.
There are other models that take that approach. I would say that the E3SM and the CESM, its ancestor model, are among the most sophisticated in that way in terms of being able to represent topographic variability at one level, variability in geomorphologic landscape types at a second nested level, variability in soil texture and soil, other soil physical properties at a third level, and finally variability in the plant functional types at a fourth subgrid level.
Yeah.
So kind of like nested dolls approach, that stuff all fits together and gives us just a really rich tapestry to be able to represent the details. Now, maybe there's one or two other Earth system models that do include that kind of sophistication. And then what makes our effort unique is that we're actually customizing those subgrid capabilities around the variability that's unique to these Arctic tundra landscapes. So for example, instead of capturing macro topographic variability, we're using our topographic units to capture micro topographic variability that's important for constraining fractional inundated area in the polygonal tundra, just as one example.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really helpful. Thanks a lot. We could probably chat about it all afternoon. But,
I would love to.
I'll pass it back to Alex and let other people have a chance to talk.
Thanks, Phil. Don't see any other questions at the moment, but I have a question for Colleen, because I know you have to go. And so this is, I mean, I'm a social scientist, although my undergrad was a BSc, and I did kind of focus on botany a bit. But so my plants, I have a plant question.
Okay.
but nowhere near the level of sophistication of the question that Phil just asked. But I noticed that it seemed like in your discussion that one of the sort of factors that you've really been able to amp up in this project that was missing before was really around vegetation and the role of vegetation structurally in terms of photosynthesis, the specific processes around tundra vegetation and changing vegetation as well. I just wonder if you could say something more about the role of vegetation and in particular and how this project has kind of driven forward knowledge in that area and what maybe still remains to be done in order to have vegetation really strongly reflected in modeling.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I am a plant ecologist, so that is something that I get very excited about. I think one of the ways that we've been able to leverage the interaction between empiricists and the models is that, as Peter was saying, the model is ready to have more plant functional types. So that was a really nice kind of hook, right? So it used to be that the tundra was just represented by a grass and a shrub. And so there's a lot of opportunity to sort of inform, right? But now that we have these new tools like, the drones and planes and satellites where we can actually, boots on the ground. And I wanted to mention, in addition to what Stan and Peter mentioned on how the empiricists and modelers have developed relationships, I think the informal component of that has also been very important. So Peter has come with us to the field and carried batteries and collected leaves from alders to see the sites, right? And we will be immersing ourselves in the models in a workshop upcoming this fall. And so developing those personal relationships have been very important too. But the other thing I would say that these new technologies let us do is scale, right? So we've done a lot of work on photosynthesis, but we've also measured where shrubs are in places our boots can walk us to. But now the drones and the planes and the satellites get us to the scale where a land surface model could potentially be validated against those measurements. And so vegetation is really an integrator of a lot of patterns across the landscape. And so it's been nice to move forward in that way.
Thanks. We have just a comment from Randy Stotler, just saying how impressed he was with the presentation, but also he's been following the project for a number of years, and yeah, just wanted to express how impressed he is overall with the project. So that was Randy's comment.
Alex, I'll
yeah,
follow up on that a little bit and just say that one of the benefits that we're realizing in the NGEE Arctic project is that because we have gone through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and even now are looking at a phase 4, we've had the benefit of this team being together for over a decade now. And there's something very special about, although people come and go, we do have a culture and a philosophy that really does allow us to tackle some difficult science questions, some difficult culture with respect to safety and data, and just does allow us to do some things that other projects maybe don't have the opportunity to do. And so we often talk about the legacy that we'll be able to leave from a decade or more of work, and simply this team working together for that length of time. I think it's a real nice opportunity. So yeah, I appreciate the comment.
Yeah, I mean, that actually segues nicely into another question I had, which was, and thank you, Colleen. Colleen has to leave us now. So thanks very much, Colleen.
Thanks, Colleen.
Take care. I'm interested in, I mean, it does seem like a pretty unique project in that sense, a very large team, sustained over a significant amount of time. I'm wondering, so this is not a science question, this is more of a policy and institutions question. What is that institutional context that has allowed that to happen and allowed the project to endure and, potentially even into a fourth phase? I know that sometimes these things, get a great momentum going, and then policymakers change, governments change. So what is it that has allowed this project to be so sustained?
Well, let me provide one answer, and then Peter might have a different response. But you know, we heard Colleen mention earlier trust and respect. Maybe we don't often think of those in terms of a science project soon enough. But I do think early in the project, we recognized that if we were going to have a big team and we were all going to be working in remote locations where safety was important, not only our safety, but the safety of others, we were all going to be sharing data in an open and visible manner, that trust and respect was going to have to permeate the project, or we would quickly get into issues of authorship and who owns the data and where is my recognition versus that of another. And I think at the onset that was very important and set the stage for the culture that developed within the project. And then we got to do all this amazing science and work with all these amazing disciplines across the lab and the field, and working with modelers. So I know we often talk first about the science, but I do think there is an underlying philosophy or psychology about how large science, big science is done, if you will. And for whatever reason, I do take a lot of pride in the fact that NGEE Arctic seems to have gotten some of that right. And it has made a big difference in the project. So Peter, maybe from your perspective?
Yeah, Stan, I'd agree with all of that. I might just add that at the level of the sponsor, we've just had an ongoing, very positive interaction with the program managers and up the chain at DOE VER, and that steady communication, I think, and making sure that we understand them and that they understand what we're doing and where we're headed and why. That's just been a really good conversation all along, in my perspective.
Sounds quite remarkable. I think, again, I can't speak necessarily from the natural scientist perspective, but look with some envy upon that context, that institutional context support that you've had to be able to do that. I see another question here from Phil. I'll allow you to talk again, Phil. Phil, if you want to unmute, we should be able to hear you.
Oh, yes, there we go, unmuted. Sorry for another question. So as a hydrologist, like a lot of the things I do and your group does overlap, of course, but the one thing that I think is missing, but maybe I'm missing it, is lateral runoff and stream flow. Is that something that you've considered and included, or is that something that's, for your purposes, not seen as all that important at the moment?
Well, I'll just emphasize that Phil, it is important. And I know that provides the motivation for some of the modeling that Peter talked about earlier. Peter, do you want to put that in the context and maybe some of the hill slope hydrology or inundation?
Yeah, I didn't, we just kind of picked some of the highlights to present. And so we didn't talk about the integrated modeling topic, which was focused on representing hill slopes in ELM. And that's based on using fine scale models like ATS to predict coupled surface, subsurface hydrology, both in the very flat kind of polygonal ground landscapes and the micro topography that connects those landscapes together, and in the more normal, I'd say, terrain in the Seward Peninsula, where you have observable stream networks. And we are trying to connect the fine scale process representation of that kind of both surface and subsurface flow. So yes, the 3D lateral flows, connect that to parameterizations that then are relevant within a model like ELM, because even when we go to 1 kilometer grid scale, which maybe that's our most ambitious global scale resolution. There's of course a lot of subgrid lateral transport process that happens within that in many places that we need to parameterize. And so being able to come up with that parameterization in these challenging permafrost and discontinuous permafrost landscapes is actually one of the 6 primary targets for our model development.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks very much. That's helpful.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions from the audience. I'm going to give the audience a couple more minutes to think if they have anything to ask. In the meantime, I have one final question from me. And this, you know, again, speaks a little bit to my coming from outside the disciplinary areas that you're representing. But I mean, I think that you talk with modeling, you know, it's this, several times in the presentation, you know, touched on this as well. It's like seconds to centuries and you know, centimeters to global scale. And certainly I can see how important it is to understand these micro scale processes and landscape scale processes, to work those up to a model that's on a higher scale that can answer questions about, you know, global environmental change, could even answer questions about, broadly speaking, about change in the Arctic. But you're also talking about predictive capacity and possibilities back down to those smaller scales, as I understand it. And you also noted you know, some of your relationships with working with communities in the north, and I guess what I'm wondering is, in terms of kind of some of the eventual products of your work, in addition to those higher level understandings of global processes and Arctic level processes, what are communities on the ground looking for in terms of, or what do you think you can provide them, is another way of asking the question, in terms of the predictive capacity as this model is, these models are built out, and predictive accuracy increases. What are the kinds of questions that you really want to be able to answer on that really local scale that's really relevant to folks living there?
Okay. Peter, do you want to take an initial cut at that, and then I'll chime in?
Yeah, I can try. The project has made efforts to reach out to those communities and have the conversations about, you know, what are the areas of interest, what are the needs, what are the questions that they're asking. And on the top of my head, I actually don't have a good list of what those are, but I can say that the kinds of things that our predictive models are aiming at, when you mentioned sort of a high resolution or a local scale prediction, we do want to be able to not just say, you know, there's a certain amount of carbon being taken up or carbon being lost over a 2 by 2 degree domain in the Arctic tundra, but rather to say, here are the kinds of places where you might see permafrost loss, changes in active layer thickness, changes in soil moisture content, and changes in seasonal dynamics of freeze thaw, which can be very complicated depending on how snowpack changes and how vegetation types shift. There's a lot of interesting information that can be put on the table. And then in some ways, my sense is that each person or each community might have very different needs, but at least we can make available that collection of information at a spatial scale where it would be relevant for answering those kinds of questions.
Alex, I would just add to that we talked about phase 1, 2, and 3 of the NGEE Arctic project. And in phase 2, we moved from the North Slope over to the Seward Peninsula. And I don't recall if it was intentional or not, but as it worked out, all of our sites now fall on native land as opposed to federal agency lands. And because of that, as a project director, I had to sit down and had the benefit and pleasure of sitting down with Native corporations, elders, and describing for them what we were going to be doing on their lands and what we were going to be providing on behalf of the Department of Energy in terms of global climate predictions. And it was a real pleasure then to get those kind of questions that I think you're referring to as to, well, what are going to happen to shrubs in the area? What about migration? What about rain on snow events? And how might that affect our transportation and infrastructure? And it was really just, for me, an eye-opening experience to have those kind of questions asked. And I think it's an area where, as scientists, we're slowly moving into. I think it's our responsibility to move into providing answers to those kind of questions, even if they don't quite align with the goals of our sponsor, because we are in the communities, we are working on lands and with people that have real questions and real needs. And so I think that's been a real benefit of, again, this long-term association that we have with sponsors, people on the project, community members, and the Native corporations, and really providing a different glimpse of what science can contribute when we're paying attention to the questions being asked. So,
yeah, thank you for that. I definitely, I mean, my experience working in communities in the North is that there is a real hunger to know what's going to happen, because they've seen such rapid change, and often the traditional knowledge that they hold isn't able to really incorporate what's happening in with these rapid changes. So really looking for those sorts of predictive answers to what they might expect in the future. So that sounds really beneficial output of the project. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think I'm gonna call it. So thank you very much, all three of you. Colleen, even though she's not here anymore, Stan, Peter, for your really fascinating presentation, and I also really enjoyed your responses to the questions. I concur with Randy. I mean, you're doing really exceptional work, and as I mentioned, you know, just this long-term project, so many collaborators, all the interdisciplinarity, it really is really impressive. And you've given us a lot to think about in terms of like the complex interactions that you're working with, and translating changing climatic conditions into you know, webs of interactions and effects, and what those might look like in particular landscapes. All that heterogeneity, and trying to bring that up to larger scales. I mean, it's really fascinating, and so truly thank you.
Alex, let me mention that I did mention that NGEE Arctic will likely have a phase 4,
right?
And a key component of that will be international collaborations, site-specific comparisons of some of our models, and then Pan-Arctic simulations. And we will certainly be looking to the Cold Regions Research Center and others to partner with us in that phase 4 activity as we move from our individual sites in Alaska to more Pan-Arctic perspective. And so today's presentation and our interaction is part of that journey. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, that's great to hear. I know that the folks who attended will certainly be looking forward to more opportunities to engage and to be involved in that 4th phase. So yeah, just to finish off, then I'd just like to thank the folks who made the event possible. In addition to our panelists, thank you to Phil for first approaching Stan with the invitation. Thanks to Gifty Attia and Jeremy Leathers from our early career researcher team for supporting logistics and publicity, Trina King for our poster, and those folks in our networks who helped us reach out. So yeah, thanks again very much, and enjoy your day, everyone, and I look forward to being in touch again sometime.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.